So the word is chattel, and it is an item of property other than real estate. Yeah. Okay, so chattel comes from the French word. I didn't write down what the actual French word was, but I wouldn't be able to pronounce it anyway. It's something, yeah, you probably, I mean, you could, but I don't have it written down. So it's from a French word, and originally the French word meant property, profit, but then also cattle. So it's kind of related to possessions that you own as part of your wealth and part of your your status in society, but it is not property itself. And it was a word that was adopted by the abolitionists. So no one was really using it to describe what slavery was until people were starting to talk about being anti-slavery. So it's not like a slave owner would say, oh, this is my chattel. They wouldn't. They most often imagine themselves in a different kind of relationship to their slaves. But the abolitionists were saying, we're using that word chattel to describe what like the position of being, what the status of being a slave actually was. So it was a rhetorical term that they were using to try and get people to feel more uncomfortable about slavery when they're like, oh, people shouldn't be possessions and objects, and let's make that very clear by using this word that's closely associated with cattle. So I want you to go to page 8, well, VII of your books. VIII, Roman numeral 8. There we go. All right, so a very famous abolitionist named William Lloyd Garrison wrote this letter to start off Frederick Douglass's book as the preface. And on page 8, Roman numeral 8, he uses this word chattel. So it's at the end of that first big paragraph. He says, capable of high attainments as an intellectual and moral being, needing nothing but a comparatively small amount of cultivation to make him an ornament to society and a blessing to his race, by the law of the land, by the voice of the people, by the terms of the slave code, he was only a piece of property, a beast of burden, a chattel, personal, nevertheless, a chattel personal, like a chattel that is owned by a person, nevertheless. So you're going to write down for your example, he was only a piece of property, a beast of burden, a chattel personal, nevertheless. Hey, I'm grading your, as you're copying this, I'm grading your Scarlet Letter essays. So if you turned it in on paper, it is graded and it's in the box over there. They're going well. You guys are doing a good job. I haven't read yours yet. Okay, well, if you were someone who turned it in on paper, they are going well. Can I get one of those? Yeah. Yes, but we need to check it out too, so don't leave before you come here. I was looking in our packet for that, and I was like, I can't find like this Frederick Douglass thing. Yeah. All y'all that have printers. In the next couple days. Yeah, and I was telling Claire Heyer about this. There was confusion. For these Scarlet Letter essays, I won't have them graded in time for me to feel good about rewrites due on the 8th. So for everything else for the quarter, everything is due on the 8th. So I mean, there will be like a couple things in October, and all of that's due on the 8th. But for these Scarlet Letter rewrites, I can take them up until the end of the quarter, which is October 15th. So that doesn't count if you haven't actually done the essay. If you haven't done the essay, my due date for this quarter is October 8th, this Friday. But if you're wanting to rewrite it, once you see your score, you can have till October 15th. Because I think I'll be able to grade all of these by, I'm going to be conservative and say Thursday. They'll be graded by Thursday. Okay.
they're going on Discord, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then after October 8th, everything past October 8th that is due will go on the next quarter. Yeah, so I think the only two things left that you really have going on to this quarter are, well, three things. Your Frederick Douglass annotations for the stuff that you just read, and then chapters 3 through 8. So that's 2 assignments. And then next week, which I haven't decided yet, maybe Tuesday for you guys, Thursday, I'm going to take your binders and make sure you've got all the words of the day and so on. And that'll be a very small score. Okay. So this sentence, you have this sentence written down now, right? He was only a piece of property, a beast of burden, a chattel personal, nevertheless. You want to compare this. I didn't have you write down the entire thing, but we want to compare this to what comes before. Like he's talking about how this person that he just met is capable of high attainments as an intellectual and moral being, needing nothing but a comparatively small amount of cultivation to make him an ornament to society and a blessing to his race. So the first half of the sentence is all about how amazing Frederick Douglass is, right? That all he needed was like a tiny bit of cultivation, a tiny bit of like freedom or a little bit of leeway. Basically, in Frederick Douglass's story that you're going to hear about is he had one master who taught him the ABCs before she decided, oh, I shouldn't be teaching a slave to read. So like just this one little bit of cultivation, he was able to take that and run with it and become the speaker and the writer that he is. So here's William Lloyd Garrison saying like, how amazing could this guy be, or is he? And then he says, but by the law of the land, by the voice of the people, by the terms of the slave code, he was only a piece of property, a beast of burden, a chattel personal, nevertheless. Think about the parallelism that happens in that sentence as you look at it on the page. Like there's 3 parts to each. He is by the law of the land, by the voice of the people, by the terms of the slave code, versus piece of property, beast of burden, chattel personal. So first of all, let's talk about that parallelism of the 3 different parts. Why do you think that he would want to do the rule of 3s here? Yeah, Gracie.
Well, I think, I mean, not necessarily about like the rule of 3, but by showing like the difference, like he's like such an amazing, like he was able to take just like the tiniest bit and be able to like become this great like writer and author. Mm-hmm. But they're like having him, like comparing him to like an object that like can't do any of that.
Yeah, good. So that like juxtaposition between him having this like the high attainments of intellectual and moral being with this word chattel creates that like really sharp cognitive dissonance, like dissonance in the way that you're thinking about him, where it's like, okay, he's this amazing speaker. I'm about to read this book by him that has been a huge bestseller and like very influential. And then he is also considered by everybody else, the law and people in general, property. And that sharp juxtaposition creates some, I think, emotional and logical dissonance. Why else do you think he would use the parallel structure? Law of the land, voice of the people, terms of the slave code. Piece of property. You know what? I'm going to write this up on the board. I think it'll be clearer. This is what I mean by the parallelism. There's 3 separate clauses that are set up in order, right? So tell me why he would have these 3 things. Law of the land, voice of the people, terms of the slave code. Basically, all 3 of these mean law, right? Law under democracy. Piece of property, beast of burden, chattel personal. All 3 of these things mean possession. So why not just say, oh, but under the laws of the land, people viewed him as a possession? Why set it up in this way with the 3 different things? Yeah, Kaylee.
So I think you can match them up with the that's how it works. Like the law says that was a piece of your property. If you died, it was in your will. This happens to this slave, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And the voice of the people made like talked about them as beasts. And that was like a big thing that abolitionists were trying to terms of the slave code or what made them the child person, like made them into
Yeah.
the like sort of cattle. That's what the slave code did. Like it kind of lined them up in a way.
Yes, I totally agree. So that the terms of their enslavement becomes like almost overwhelming, where it's like the terms of their enslavement are both about property law, rhetoric, so property law, rhetoric, and sort of convention. The terms of the slave code, it's like common convention, and all three of those together are acting to keep them enslaved in these three different ways, as being a property, by talking about them as beasts, and ultimately by being this like piece of this possession that's associated with animalism, you know. Tell me about this word. Why do you think the abolitionists would really focus on using this word rather than saying just slaves? Yeah, Elsa.
It makes you more connected to animals. And it's like, why are we treating beings like they're an animal? We
Yeah.
wouldn't even treat an animal in this way. Like if like a horse, you know, breaks down, they're gonna like take care of it and get it better unless it can't be helped.
Mhm.
And then when something goes wrong with the slaves, they beat them and make them hurt.
Yeah, right, right.
Put them into submission, and you don't really do those. All you do is like little bit, but it's way worse than what they're doing to animals.
Yeah, good. And I think that he achieves, I think the use of that word chattel in the 1840s when this is being written is a lot different than maybe 300 years earlier. By this point, if people are still comfortable with slavery, so like if you're living in the South in 1840s, but you're talking to somebody who is an abolitionist and is not comfortable with slavery, you are not using the language of like beasts of burden, chattel. You are using the language of like, oh, we treat our slaves as though they are our family members. What would they do if it weren't for us? Who would feed and house them? A big part of the rhetoric coming from the South is like they're not capable of taking care of themselves, and we take them in and we take care of them. So there wasn't another like really vocal side in government or like really loudly saying like, no, we're not going to like give people equal rights because they are, you know, beasts of burden. They're not that openly racist in terms of like public rhetoric going on. But the abolitionists, by using this word, are kind of like forcing that kind of on the slave system and saying, no, it actually is very similar to how you would treat, you know, animal possessions. Yeah.
Yeah, the South are trying to leave that out of the argument, but they're like, no, this is part of it.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah,
the-
exactly. Yes. Yep. Okay, write down some effects then of using this word chattel in that section. That's a word you're going to see over and over again in this book, so I wanted to make sure you knew what it was. And then you're going to want to get out your notes. So we're going to talk about the context of this book. Yes. All right, it's been a while, but do you remember soapstones? Who could forget soapstones?
The best.
All right, the first one is subject. Sometimes we forget that one. What's the O stand for? What does the A stand for?
Audience.
What does the P stand for?
Purpose.
What does this S stand for? Speaker, yeah. And then this last S?
Style.
Style. Who had that?
I look at it every time.
That's awesome. So we talked about this a little bit. This is what like helps us provide the context for our essay. This is always really good stuff to include in the introduction, and we'll talk about how to include it in your intro. But in order to fully understand this book, I think we need to go through soapstones. So why don't you take out your Chromebooks and get those booted up? Yeah. I don't have any chargers, just, it's not gonna be totally essential today if it's not working. Okay, you could use your phone too. Yeah, we keep asking them to give us chargers, but they say, no, they'll bring their chargers. Oh, yeah, we got an extra one. Okay, don't forget to get it back to me. No? Oh, okay. It was a good effort, though. All right, you got note paper out. You're getting those. It doesn't. You can just do it on the same stuff. Yeah. We're just writing some stuff down. Okay, so as those computers are getting started, we're going to brainstorm whatever we can about soapstones. Let's say you got a piece from this book on the AP Lang test, and let's pretend you hadn't studied it. You just have to kind of figure out everything you already know that's going on around this book. Even if you have not encountered the piece of rhetoric before, you're still kind of expected to know like a little bit of, usually it's US history, but like a little bit of history so that you can kind of place it at a certain moment, which is not as stressful as it sounds. But this was published in 1846, am I right? I don't either, it doesn't say in here. Oh boy, that's something I need to know. 1845, thank you. So it's published in 1845, and yeah, there it is on the very back. And there's some stuff going on around that time period that you're probably already familiar with because you've already done a little bit of American history. You also have already started to read the book, so you've got like a little bit of context that way. So I'm going to give you a minute or so per part of Soapstones to brainstorm about what you already know, and then very quickly look stuff up if you have time to look it up. So while the computers are booting, though, we can do subject because you won't need to really look anything up to do subject. So I'm going to give you 1 minute, and you're going to write down all of the subjects that you think that this book might cover or already is covering. Okay, go ahead. Oops, I immediately got out of my timer. You're just writing down everything you know about subject. Okay, so that was just subject. Let's move on to occasion. I'm going to give you 3 minutes for occasion. You're going to brainstorm everything you can think about the occasion. So 1845, what's going on? How was this occasion? Is the what, the genre, the where it was published or where it was important, and the when. So anything you know about or what's happening around 1845, you're putting all of that down. And then this is where you can use your computers to look stuff up. Look stuff up. Okay, go ahead. Whew.
Yeah, it was. Where was it again? It was published by,
Why else would you go to some random town? I guess, but like going to like going to like.
So you're only focusing on occasion, everything that you can possibly say about the occasion. Even if it feels like it doesn't apply. What's going on in 1845?
I'm just gonna look up major events.
I'm not good at history.
Can we do like the 1840s as a whole?
Yes. Yeah, anything leading up to it. I would even start 1820s, 1830s.
Treaty of Guadalupe.
Trust me. Better than you want.
You like Mr. Noel? No. I like him way better than Mr. Stone. It's just not a pedophile.
No, he is not. He's just a nerd.
No, that's not why I think so.
Mr. Stone, you said?
I just, I'm uncomfortable in his costume. Mr. Stone makes me feel really uncomfortable to the point that I dropped his class.
Really?
He says he keeps the costume really cold, so I can keep her up and like put on sweatshirts. And that made us all really uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's not a
We
good
all,
thing
like,
to
dropped
say.
off his class.
Was he joking?
No, he's being dead serious. Different class periods, and all of my friends said it was
That was not a good thing to say.
awesome.
All right, let me tell you a little bit about the occasion, and then you guys can add to what I tell you, because I'm going to tell you sort of about the immediate occasion here. So, Frederick Douglass, I don't want to spoil anything. I don't want to give away how he gets out of slavery or that kind of thing, but he does eventually get out. Well, we talked about that being a trope of the slave narrative, right? And he writes a book. So he eventually escapes to the north. He is at an abolitionist meeting, and he gets up and he speaks and he tells about his experience. And William Lloyd Garrison is there. William Lloyd Garrison was the head of the Anti-Slavery Society. He started the Anti-Slavery Society, and so he was this very prominent lawyer, I want to say. I have it written down. Journalist, sorry, he's the journalist. He was a really prominent journalist. He started like the anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. He was also way into civil disobedience, that Thoreau essay. He was like very anti-government, the way that Thoreau was. So here he is at this abolitionist meeting, and Frederick Douglass is speaking. And Garrison says, I think that you need to write a book about this. Or he didn't say book. He said, I think you need to tell other people about this. So Garrison sets Frederick Douglass up with like a tour around the North. And they went to many, many different places. And he would give this same speech each time that like told about his experience with slavery and how he got out. So then in 1845, he actually put that kind of speech that he was giving into book format, obviously like made it longer and published this book. And because he published this book with names, all of the names in this book are real. So, he names people who were extremely cruel to their slaves. You're going to read all about it. All those names in here are real. And because he names the places where he was born and who his like slave masters were, he could have legally been forced back into slavery because there were fugitive slave laws. So if he's up there in the north saying, I am an escaped slave, the South could come and get him and take him back down into slavery. So he really really sacrificed a lot in order to give those specifics. So immediately after publication, he was shipped off by this anti-slavery society, shipped off to England. And he lived in England for 2 years. They loved him in England. Slavery had been abolished about 50 years in England. They really saw him as like kind of an example about why that was the right choice. So he was very well taken care of there. His book became an instant bestseller. And so he could have bought back his own freedom at that point, but instead there were 2 English friends that sent the money back and bought his freedom so that then he could come back to America. And because the book was so popular, he started his own newspaper. So William Lloyd Garrison had his paper called The Liberator, and Frederick Douglass started one called the North Star, because the North Star was the star that you follow to get to the north, right, to escape from slavery. And the difference between the papers, I mean, the North Star was way more interested in publishing Black narratives rather than the Liberator, which would publish some Black people writing, but mostly from other white abolitionists. So he kind of started his own paper that way and became very wealthy and very successful. So that's kind of the occasion around what's happening with this book. What did you find about like the occasion, about the history? Yeah, Kaylee.
So like in the 30s, the Second Great Awakening happened. That.
Yes.
And there's a lot of religious things.
Yeah. Yeah, so Second Great Awakening, and this is sort of like 30 years down the road, or no,
Only like
15 years down the road, and kind of how people are thinking about stuff. I think it's related to transcendentalism that way too. Yeah, Leah. Yeah.
I think, I'm not like 100% sure, but you would think that they're trying to decide, like, should we continue slavery in these new territories? Like,
Yeah. Yes, and every state was a huge fight to add to the Union, whether or not they were slave state or an abolitionist state, because that's going to like tip the scales in terms of which side is going to win. Yeah.
That's basically what I was gonna say, like a whole bunch of argument between slave and free states, like adding them into the union and stuff, like
Yeah.
if they added one, then the other had to be added as well. It
Yeah.
had to be a perfect balance.
Yes. Good.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, kind of like, because like Texas was just added, like, I think in 1845, and it was a slave state, and it's like a huge territory, so it was like big deal.
Yeah, good. Any other things that you were finding out about that time period? There was a lot of like social upheaval in Europe at the time too. They were having a lot of revolutions based on like, the idea of like libertad, and giving people more of a voice. And you have a lot of states that are starting, or a lot of countries that are starting to shut down that slave trade a little more adamantly. Okay, now I'm going to give you a couple minutes to research audience. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and you're going to think of all you can about who the likely audience is for this narrative. You're trying to get specific. Okay, go ahead.
It would be the same thing now. Or it'd be like. What I said. Yeah. all you were.
Okay, let me tell you a couple things about the audience too. So these speeches that Douglas was going around giving to different abolitionist meetings throughout the North, they were very popular, but people who were listening to him and then people who later read the book without listening to him, they really doubted they were his own words. These are mostly almost completely white meetings. And the people there were just like, I don't think that this guy could possibly be so eloquent on this subject. They were very skeptical about it. Yes.
Kind of ironic, people like, oh yeah, we want to abolish slavery.
Yes.
But at the same time, we're like, no, blacks aren't equal to us because they don't think that they can be quite as good as us.
Yeah.
But something I really liked in the preface was about like, look how wonderfully that they've done it. Like people like Frederick Douglass who have had limited access to education have advanced themselves so much.
Yes.
It's not because they are stupid, it's because they had less time and access to resources to help them advance.
Yes.
That's the only difference.
Absolutely. And that's why they hit that point so hard in the preface and the letter, is because people were skeptical about this. And I think they were trying to like cut off this idea of like just having a racist idea about capabilities. But people were also skeptical that somebody could be that much of a, did I tell you this word last time, autodidact? To be an autodidact means to like teach yourself, and Frederick Douglass completely taught himself to read. So this idea that somebody could be an autodidact to like that level and to be able to write this book, people were skeptical about that too. I mean, even regardless of race in that aspect, but you can't really say regardless of race about anything in 1840. So I don't know. Josie?
Honestly, it kind of shocks me like how hearing this, that like people didn't believe it because they didn't believe he could like write something that like advances this. And not because they thought that like everything that was happening with slavery was like,
Oh,
so
yeah.
absurd and out of this world. It was more like, you can't write this. Like that shocks me.
I know, but they were kind of aware. I mean, at this point, this is not the first slave narrative. And so they were aware of the horrors that happened during slavery, and they were also aware of the genre characteristics that this is going to hit. So I don't think that this book was shocking, in that aspect. It was more like Frederick Douglass is capable of this, Yeah, Elsa?
Something I find really interesting is racism is different depending on what time period you're in. Like it's slowly advanced. Like our idea of not being racist today is completely different from what they thought not being racist was.
Yes.
Like as time goes on, like my great grandmother, totally racist, 100%. My grandmother would have freedom walks and did all those things, but she still did not approve of my mom. She was engaged to a black man once. She was like, no, not for my daughter.
Yeah.
So my grandmother did advance herself in the sense that she's not racist as her mother, but she still doesn't think we could enough for her daughter.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important to
But then my
recognize.
mother's fully fine if I marry a black man. Like,
Yeah.
Each generation I think it's better.
It's so fascinating to me because I actually just watched a TikTok about this, but it was about Eminem. But it was sort of like each generation feels like they're solving the world's problems for the first time. Like, oh, we're attacking this thing that has been so awful, but it's been like generations of like incremental change. I think that's super important to realize when we're reading this book, especially. Yeah.
Adding on to like what she said about holding, like the first thing is that I noticed that like by doing the endorsements today, that seems racist because why do you need to verify as a white man that this black man is valid?
Yeah.
But then at the time, like it was racist, but it was more in like helping the cause because you could say, okay, he's valid on his own, like I don't need to validate for him. But then at the time white people would listen.
Yes. Absolutely.
Also, I get that, because it's so funny, because my grandma's an immigrant from Guatemala, but she doesn't like being paid any art. And I'm like,
She wants you to find somebody with a
She
lighter
likes
skin tone.
white men with blue eyes.
Oh,
And I'm like,
interesting.
Grandma, you're not even white.
Grandparents, they're the worst. That's so funny. And also not funny at all, just like internalized racism. It's like actually very tragic. Yeah. All right. So yeah, that's part of the reason for the 2 letters at the beginning. Oh yeah, Kaylee.
I was just gonna like kind of add on to this idea of how we like get better, but we're not there yet. Like, I wonder what people will say about us, like what our
Yes.
people will say about us, like, oh, they were so bad about this and this and this, and what we'll think about that.
Because there will be some things like it's yeah, I always think about that too. I'm like, what am I gonna get called out for as an old person that I'm like holding, like my parents, for whatever reason, no, not my parents, they're over this, but my grandparents, like they cannot get over not saying that people are Oriental. They just can't. They try so hard in all other different aspects, but that word, it's just like, no, that word is not offensive, and they just grasp onto that. I don't know what that is about old people, but we're all gonna get there. It's gonna happen. Yeah, Brennan.
One thing I think your generation could be like about is the meat industry.
That could be, yeah, I could definitely see that. Yeah.
How we treat each other.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, earth stuff, okay. All right, sorry, we're off topic though, I gotta keep going. So the other thing though, the other thing that the letters are for as well, so as he was giving speeches, a lot of his audience were like, stick to the facts of your own experience. We want you to tell things the way that things happened, and we find that valuable. But anytime you sort of like go off and pontificate about like philosophy or religion or these bigger critical ideas, they're like, we don't necessarily want that from you. So this wasn't every audience member, but this was an opinion that was spoken a lot at these abolitionist meetings. And you'll notice as you read this that Frederick Douglass completely ignores that criticism and is like very interested in that critical thought and philosophizing about religion and so on. So that's something to be aware of too, that when he's doing that, he's being rebellious not only against like, white Southern racists, but against the people who were supporting his own cause. So he kind of, he finds hypocrisy everywhere. I think that's valuable to know. Yeah.
I think that like even though they are kind of racist, they're doing the best they can.
I mean, imagine being an abolitionist in
Well,
1840.
exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine like the South moving up to the North. They're gonna do their best depending on what they see,
Yeah.
Nobody's just instantly gonna change their way of thought. They're gonna be able up to that. And
Yeah.
have to grow.
But I think
I think it's not bad.
no, yeah. And the important thing to remember, I think, with this book is that Frederick Douglass's ideas, okay, I'm trying not to misspeak, but I think from what I've read of his other speeches as well, Frederick Douglass's ideas would be very comfortable in 2021. So he was there and kind of like pulling people along and being like, I know you're trying to do your best, but just do like a little bit better and we'll keep going along this. So like him talking about, you're going to get a lot about him talking about the hypocrisy of like Christianity in the South. That was not in line with what his audience wanted to hear, but he went there anyway. Yeah.
That's just what's so great about like Frederick Douglass. That makes people realize what they are doing wrong.
Yes.
Like if you're going and you're doing this one thing the whole way, like time your shoes wrong, you're not gonna realize you're doing that wrong. Come and tell us you're doing it
Yeah.
wrong.
And he was very open about telling people they were doing wrong. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
I
Josie.
feel like that's something that people be kind of like surprised today. We're like, oh, like we're really trying hard to like, oh, like fighting climate change, like, oh, let's make all this like getting rid of plastic straws.
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah, that can help the cause, but like, what if you like completely like change our whole like system, like it's just something like so, and people are like, oh no, like we have to like go slow and start with like, changing laws or
Yes.
whatever. I think that's kind of like similar to how that would be, being like, no, like these are all the problems and we really should be attacking them.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to put that here under purpose. It's like he was interested in this idea of systemic change and not just individual change. And that's why he's constantly talking about how, okay, this certain master that I had, he was seen as kind. He was seen as one of the good ones, you know, and yet still his actions are horrific. Let's kind of unpack why, and let's unpack why it's the system itself is corrupt and not just like a few, you know, bad apples, because that's an idea that people are fighting against during this time period too. Okay, I'm gonna give you 2 minutes now to do, no, I don't want to do speaker because you're gonna find out too much about him. Let's stop there with soapstones. Okay, because I don't want you to find out how the story ends yet. We're doing soap today, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so then, before we get into this next part, indulge me in an activity. I am going to have you draw a quick family tree for yourself.
Oh, no.
That's not John.
So, you know, whatever you know about your, I know some families, it's a bit more, I don't know, there was some guy over here. But try to construct a family tree just for yourself on scrap paper. And while you're doing that, I'm gonna come around and look for annotations.